Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear further evidence from Dr. Barbara Lane. So without more ado, I shall ask the usher to invite Dr. Lane into the hearing room. Good morning, Dr. Lane.
Morning.
All ready to continue?
Yep, a bit nervous this morning, so hopefully I'll just need to calm down in a few minutes.
You're probably not the only one, but
right, yeah,
if at any stage you feel you need a break, you know.
Yeah, no, I will say that if you don't mind. Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Millett, when you're ready.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Good morning, members of the panel. Good morning, Dr. Lane.
Yeah.
I'd like to turn now, please, to the question of the Aov system at Grenfell. And when I say the Aov system, I mean the old one, not the new one, if you know what
Understood,
I mean.
yeah.
Right. Now, I'd like to look with you, if I may, at Mr. Stokes' assessment of the Aov system, and you address that in Chapter 8 of your report, at sections 12.3 to 12.5. And just for the reference, it's a BLARP 250/27, pages 266 to 281. Now, can I just show you paragraph 12.3.13 at BLARP 250/27 at page 267, which is 2 pages into your analysis.
Yeah.
And you say there, at 12.3.13, having quoted from past 79 in the previous paragraph, on this basis, it is reasonable to expect a risk assessor for a building which relies on such a system to be able to describe the system performance and the consequences should that system be non-operational.
Yeah.
My question is, are you basing your opinion that you expressed there on the parts of Clause 15 of past 79 that are referred to?
Yes, and say my own experience. And just I should be very clear, it's at a very basic level, so very basic performance requirements.
Right. Yep. And is it your opinion that the reasonably competent fire risk assessor should consider the potential for means of escape to be compromised by a ventilation system that doesn't work?
If the means of escape relies on a ventilation system, and whichever components of the means of escape route rely on the ventilation system, yes, it's relevant to the risk assessor's assessment.
Yes. So just to summarise, see if I've got this clear, is the gist of your opinion that a fire risk assessor needs to examine whether an active fire protection measure such as an Aov system is actually working and is actually subject to a proper inspection and maintenance regime? And if it's not, then to assess the adequacy of other protection measures to mitigate against the increased risk? Yes,
but for any type of, we'll say, smoke ventilation system, I would not expect a risk assessor, unless they had expertise in this it's a complex area in my opinion, to carry out a massive inspection as a matter of course. What I've made clear when I looked at Mr. Stokes' work was any risk assessor should be able to rely on evidence from routine inspections or a simple fire strategy document that sets out enough information to form a view. I don't want to imply Mr. Stokes should have done a massive inspection of that system in Grenfell Tower in any way.
No, but the premise of my question is that if the fire risk assessor learns that the Aov system isn't working or isn't working properly, or has no information as to whether it's being properly maintained and inspected regularly, then is your opinion that fire risk assessor needs to assess the adequacy of the other protection measures in the building?
Yes. So both those problems are relevant to the assessment of risk, and one needs to determine whether or not alternative control measures are required.
And if the fire risk assessor fails to consider both of those problems, does that affect the suitability and sufficiency of the fire risk assessment?
It can affect the suitability and sufficiency of the fire risk assessment if the risk to life is very dependent on the performance of that system or any system, and no other control measure is put in place.
Now, bearing in mind what you just said
Yeah.
about not expecting Mr. Stokes to undertake a massive and complex examination of the Aov system, bearing that in mind,
Yes.
when a fire risk assessor assesses a building, what, in your view, should somebody in Mr. Stokes' position do by way of examining the AOV, its operation and its maintenance?
I just am very conscious of the circumstances in Grenfell Tower. Okay.
Let's focus on Grenfell Tower. Then.
Yeah. So, as you will know from my report, I didn't make any comments about inspection. I focused on Mr. Stokes raising his. He asked several times for evidence, the routine testing, and his opinion on the frequency of maintenance if it was occurring. Okay? And I focused on that when I was giving my opinion about his work.
Yes. And you do say at 12.3.15, it's on the screen, that you would expect him to make reasonable inquiries of the KCTMO of the system's function or ask for the functionality to be demonstrated. In your opinion, did he do that?
Did he make reasonable inquiry?
Yes.
Well, he wrote it into several risk assessments that he needed to be, I mean, my words, reassured that that information was available. Again, it's not so simple, though, because there are other pieces of evidence that show that he became aware it was substantially not functioning, and then, I'm just trying to remember the phrase, beyond repair. And those two issues were not recorded in the risk assessment that came after he became aware of those two pieces of information.
Should Mr. Stokes examine the records of operation and maintenance?
In my opinion, yes. He gave the impression in his risk assessment he may have tried to, because he said he needed to know if they were there. I don't want to translate too much else into that, but he wrote down, please confirm. So I assume he either didn't know or went to find them and couldn't. I'm not aware of the status.
And should Mr. Stokes have noted the relevant records that were missing in his fire risk assessment?
The relevant records.
If records were missing, to note them.
I think that's the next level. Look, I know how few records there were, so it's hard to say that he should have listed out things that weren't there. Yeah.
Why would you expect Mr. Stokes to ask for the functionality to be demonstrated?
Well, in the absence of anything else, he seemed to be under the impression, I mean, I don't have his risk assessment in front of me there. I think I can't remember if he thought it was weekly or monthly testing was happening, or he was certainly asked about that. Anyway, I'll keep going. And I think if he was concerned if he tried to look for records, and I don't know, and if he was concerned about the absence of records, an alternative route to him would be to witness the so-called routine test. I see.
So when we look at 12.3.15, you expect him to make reasonable inquiries of the functionality, and if those inquiries don't yield a satisfactory answer, then ask for the system to be demonstrated.
Another alternative available to you is apparently the responsible person is carrying out a weekly or a monthly test or some other more detailed inspection. That could be an alternative.
Yes. And would that be on each occasion that he conducts an FRA?
So again, very much back to Grenfell. If the next time he went, and we can see that's what happened, it was the same situation again. That shows you another, as we were talking about yesterday, and my memory was this was something that was on his, yes, it was. He had listed this in the action plan as opposed to the main risk assessment. So very much, yes, if that's not been closed out, as we discussed yesterday, you're in a different position to the very first time you noticed it.
Yes.
And the same routes are open to you again, but it's the responsible person now who has to deal with the matter.
Now, Mr. Stokes told us that he would inspect parts of the AOV that were visually available. Is that kind of inspection, whatever visually available means, the kind of inspection that you would expect to take place?
Yeah, I think as you're walking through, depending on the system and its visibility, because it depends how it's been designed and installed, there are some features one can observe without carrying out a major inspection.
And what would those be, for example?
It depends what's visible, Mr. Millett. So you see, I don't know if Mr. Stokes peered through the grills or took the grills down, so I don't want to speculate. But let's put it another way. For example, when the brigade carried out their inspection, they made comments on, for example, the openness or that some of the AOVs appear to be stuck in an open position. And you would have to make a judgment on that based on if it had become recently open or had been stuck open for some time. And that's a function of dirt and other conditions around the AOV.
So manifest defects on any system.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's all I would expect any risk assessor, unless they had experience, and some fire risk assessors do have some substantial experience in the design and installation of smoke control systems.
And would you expect the fire risk assessor to document any manifest defects that they did come across during the course of that inspection?
Yes, I think I've made it clear. I think that anything you observe in a risk assessment, you should record it for the record. I think that's the purpose of it.
Can we turn to page 271 then, in the same part of your report, and look at paragraph 12.3.26? You say there, at 25, which is probably the better place to start, Mr. Stokes made no reference to any deficiencies in the operation of the smoke control system. Mr. Stokes made no reference to the evidence that he relied on to establish his assumption, nor how he surveyed the system himself to conclude the system functioned as intended. That's 12.3.26. Where a fire risk assessor does decide to embark on an inspection of an AOV system, would you expect them to produce a survey report or some kind of record in the FRA or the action plan?
If they embark on an inspection, is that what you said?
Yes.
Yes, I would. I think when I was writing this is to do with the fact he said yes rather than no in his record. So I assume anyone who ticks yes has paperwork or other evidence that allows them to tick yes. Okay. Right. If he had surveyed, and that's probably quite a strong word, but if he had surveyed a limited part or certain visible aspects, or he had any other observations from his time in the tower, I would expect him to make that clear, because the scale of information allowing him to say yes is important, because of what he puts on his significant actions and finding document.
And if we turn the page to page 272, let's look together at paragraph 12.3.36 and 12.3.37. Under 12.3.36, you said, Mr. Stokes had a responsibility to identify the risks to relevant persons due to the inoperability of the smoke control system when conducting his risk assessments. As I've described, he makes no evaluation of such risk. How would you have expected him to evaluate the risk presented by the AOV system?
So generally, because this has been drawn into the new system now, so I'm dealing with that in more detail in my other report, but generally, you need to understand two things. So if the system is relied on for escape in the lobby or just to protect the stair, sorry, that's two things already, three things, excuse me. And the third thing is this matter of compartmentation, which regardless of the system being to deal with the problem in the lobby or the stair, the compartmentation is the other feature. Okay? So when Mr. Stokes became aware, and he was told quite firmly the system was beyond repair. At a minimum level, he needed to, I would have sympathy about what the system was for during escape at Grenfell Tower. We'll deal with that separately. But in terms of compartmentation, that's an issue regardless of the functional extent of the smoke control system during evacuation or firefighting. Okay? So as a minimum, I would have expected him to make clear that could also have been a problem. Because I don't know if the dampers were how many dampers were stuck open, or how many vents were stuck open, and so how many floors were connected together, and he didn't make that clear in his risk assessment.
And how would you, given that, how would you expect him to have evaluated the risk, by which I mean calibrated it? So he looks at the Aov system, or he's told that it's not, it's beyond repair.
Yeah.
How would that feed into his calibration?
Calibration. So I think if we think back, for example, to the evidence that exists about the fire that happened in Grenfell Tower, I think it was in 2010.
Yes.
And
April
the smoke
2010.
spread to several floors, 7 or 8. I'm sorry, I don't have all my stuff in front of me, but yeah, it spread to multiple floors. Okay, and that's relevant with respect to this exposure to harm. The number of people exposed to harm. Okay. So the more floors that are connected together in that way, the larger the number of relevant persons exposed to harm. And from the risk estimator, probability and consequence, obviously the more people exposed to harm, the more significant the consequence, and that should elevate the risk level in any building.
Would it, in your opinion, should it, in your opinion, have caused Mr. Stokes to evaluate the overall risk, which he identified as tolerable?
As you know, it's my opinion it was not tolerable when the smoke control system, let's say very particularly with respect to compartmentation, was known not to be sufficient at the time. Yes. Okay. I don't want to go on too much about this issue of escape and firefighting with the old system, because it's been drawn into the basis of compliance for the new system. I prefer to reserve a final opinion till I'm dealing with that now.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes, I understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Now,
but just compartmentation on its own is relevant to the final risk level that was concluded for the tower at that time. Okay, and it wasn't tolerable.
Now, can we look at, well, I can summarise it, I think. In Carl Stokes' 3 FRA action plans for Grenfell Tower from 2009 to 2012, in 2009 he was still at Salvus, of course, as we know, he consistently wrote in the action plan, "It is not known if this system is serviced and maintained." And he asked the TMO to confirm that the AOV was serviced and maintained. And we can look at an example if you like, but you'll recall that on each occasion he marked the action in red to show that it was a high priority.
That's correct, yeah.
Yes. Now, given that Mr. Stokes had consistently raised this issue over a 3-year period, would you have expected him to raise the absence of records and the implication may be that there's a lack of maintenance in a more explicit way with Janice Ray, rather than merely repeating the same problem in each successive action plan? Well,
you either accept that high priority is high priority, and I think he classified it as high priority every time. But I think on the second, and particularly the third time, I mean, that's a trend, isn't it? And we've been talking about that. It's a failure of the fire risk management system to deal with the life safety system. So, I mean, I think you're asking me, should he have sat everybody down? I mean, I think he should have, but I think he did raise it as a high priority for 3 years. And the responsible person did nothing about it.
And should the fact that he couldn't confirm or couldn't obtain confirmation that there were adequate arrangements in place for servicing and maintaining the Aov system at Grenfell over that period, should that fact itself have affected the risk rating of the tower?
Yes, in my opinion.
How? To what extent?
To what extent? So it's, as I said a few minutes ago, if you don't know a life safety system is being maintained, you would normally start by, having a higher risk level. You would say to the responsible person, I need the following to bring it back down to a lower level. That's the conversation I would have. So you show the consequence of not knowing. The action is meant to help the responsible person bring it down, let's say, we'll just say going up and down one level for here. Then subject to me receiving proof of routine inspections and maintenance, please note I consider the risk level would drop back to X.
And given the provisions of PAS 79, and for our note, perhaps your recollection, clause 16.3k, do you think that it was a shortcoming in the fire safety management of Grenfell Tower, which Mr. Stokes should have identified and raised in his FRA, namely the fact that after 3 years he could still not confirm adequate maintenance arrangements?
Yeah, because that's different to the first time you find it. It's evidence of a consistent failure.
Yes. And
so even more relevant to elevating risk, the risk level.
And did that failure affect the suitability and sufficiency of each of those FRAs, and in particular the November 2012 FRA?
Oh, in particular the November 2012. Why are you saying the...
Because it's the third time.
Oh, the third time. Well, is particularly 2012. Yes, particularly 2012.
And thereafter.
And exactly, and thereafter. Yes. Yeah.
So it's an increasing.
Exactly. So it's further and further evidence of a protective feature being unreliable by means of the responsible person not demonstrating their risk management system is looking after it appropriately.
Yes, thank you. Now then we come to October 2014, and let's just look at this. Yeah. It's CST 403157, page 26. I'll just show you the first page, just so that we've got the date firmly in mind. CST 403157, there's the first page, 17th of October 2014, Grenfell Tower. Yeah. FRA. If we go to page 26, we see section 9 where Mr. Stokes deals with the AOV just below halfway down the block of text on your screen. Yeah. And I'll read it out. He says this: there is an automatic opening smoke ventilation system located on each flat stroke lift lobby area. There are two sets of vents, each of two vents on opposite walls on the flat lift lobby areas. There is a smoke detector located on each flat stroke lift lobby area, which upon activation opens the vents on that floor level. Two vents are for inflow air, the other two are extraction. The mechanical extraction units and the control panels for these vents are located in the roof level plant room on the wall. There's a manual override facility located in the ground floor lift lobby area for use by the fire service. Please see section 17 above, means of giving a warning in case of fire. For more information of the lift stroke flat lobby area detectors, as part of the building's refurbishment, this smoke extraction system is being upgraded. This currently installed system was serviced by RGE Services on the 11th October 2013. This smoke extraction system incorporates dampers within the ductwork. I've read that at length to you. Yeah. What you can see here, let me ask you, it's obvious in a sense, he didn't include any details from what he'd been told earlier in the month that the system was beyond repair.
Exactly. So, first of all, it's a really good summary of the system and it shows understanding. Yeah. And then, as the evidence shows, I don't know if you're going on to show that particular evidence, but Mr. Stokes had met, I think it wasn't a Chubb, and they had been uneasy to test the system because it was so in the condition it was. And then it was, I think, the following week that Mr. Bosman confirmed the system was beyond repair. The dates are there in my report.
9th of October. Yeah. And for the reference, it's that CST 401628, page 2. We can. Would you like?
No, it's okay. But I just think the point is, as the evidence shows, there was two substantial pieces of information that Mr. Stokes himself was personally aware of, as opposed to through another party, And this is what he wrote in his risk assessment.
And nothing there about the system being beyond repair?
Nothing.
No. And my question is, do you agree that, with this proposition, that the information he had by then received, by the 17th of October, that the Aov system was beyond repair, should have not only been identified expressly here, but also factored into his risk calibration?
Yes, I do agree.
You do. Did the fact that the Aov was being replaced, or going to be replaced, by 2014, in the course of being replaced, in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower, mean that the information that the system as it wasn't working didn't need to be included?
But it wasn't being replaced in 2014.
Well, it was going to be replaced.
Well, going to be replaced doesn't help anybody.
Well,
So something
I was tempted
going
to say
to be
quite,
something can't offer protection. So I understand that the responsible person had made the decision to replace the smoke control system, but that couldn't get done in a matter of days and weeks. It was going to take a particular period of time. In the end, it took, I'm just trying to frantically remember, I think it took 2 years in the end to reach the point where it's relevant to protecting life, which is when it's installed and commissioned and operating. It's not the intention of it protects people. So until the system is working properly again, the absence of that is a potential risk to life.
And should that have been recorded in clear and express terms in Mr. Stokes's risk assessment?
In my opinion, it should have been.
And ought to have, is this right, ought to have fed through to his calibration of the overall risk to life in the building?
Yes, yes, like everything else, yes.
Yes. Now, can I then take you back to your report where we were, BLARP 25027, and this time go to page 273, and I'd like to look with you at paragraph 12.3.39, and you'll see it's at the very top of your screen.
Yeah.
You say this: the only time Mr. Stokes raises the need for a mitigation measure is in his 2014 Record of Significant Findings and Action Plan, CST 6094, where he states, can it please be confirmed what compensatory measures, if any, are being put in place whilst the installed smoke extraction systems are being upgraded? And if we look a little bit lower down your page, you say at 41, Mr. Stokes had recorded no such significant finding for the 4 years previous to this when the system was also not functioning.
Yeah.
As the risk assessor, it was the responsibility of Mr. Stokes to propose relevant control actions to mitigate the hazard of a non-operational smoke control system.
Yeah.
What would you have expected a reasonably competent fire risk assessor who didn't have specialist knowledge of the Aov system to have been able to propose about mitigation measures?
So I wrote that there. I think it's very important to understand why I wrote that, because remember, the risk assessor took the decision to rank the building as tolerable. He didn't make the decision to elevate the risk level, wait for information and drop it back down, okay? So if the risk assessor is running with tolerable, it means that's why I would be much stronger than normal about their duty to have factored in some kind of control and to made proposals for control, because they were so satisfied to retain the risk level at tolerable. I don't want to go through a list of issues today, because that's become relevant to the work I'm doing at the moment for this other report. So I prefer to get into the detail of different types of mitigation as a function of what the system is there for in the first place.
Right.
Okay?
I think you've answered a slightly different question.
I have,
which is helpful in itself, but was later on in my little plan. But never mind. Can I just go back to the question I was going to ask you, which was, you say here at 12.3.39 that he raises a need for a mitigation measure. My question is, on the basis of what Mr. Stokes was told in 2014 and knew about the Aov system and the maintenance an operation or otherwise, can you identify a mitigation measure which you say he reasonably ought to have identified to the TMO?
So I'm saying to you that he chose to keep the risk level at tolerable, and so he needed to have a list of items that allowed him to do that.
And what would that list include? Very much by way of example.
Very much by way of example, because I'm dealing with that at length at the moment, because it's being drawn in to the new system. Didn't want to go through a list today.
Right.
But
well, then
by keeping Grenfell Tower at tolerable, this may help at this stage. By keeping Grenfell Tower at tolerable, I assumed that Mr. Stokes understood how he was going to maintain compartmentation when the dampers, when the AOVs were apparently not able to do that. And he understood how evacuation could occur across the lobby. And he understood the conditions in the stair, the potential conditions in the stair without the control of smoke in the lobby. Okay, so he had three, three functions that he needed to be satisfied were controlled, in my opinion, to allow him to retain the risk level at tolerable.
Can I see if I can get further clarity on that?
Yeah.
Can I show you Mr. Todd's evidence on this?
Yeah, okay.
This is at day 168,
Yeah.
page 33. Can we just have that up, please? And if you go, please, to line 11.
Yeah.
I'd shown. Well, actually, let's start. In fact, it's useful. Let's start at the at line 3, I'm reading to Mr. Todd by way of a question, something in the 2014 action plan against this particular action item. Can it please be confirmed what compensatory measures, if any, are being put in place while the installed smoke control extract systems are being upgraded? And then he goes on, once the new extract system has been installed, then a commissioning certificate for the system must be obtained stating that the smoke extraction system is fully functional. And then the question at line 11, what would you have expected a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to have advised on what mitigation measures were required rather than leaving it to the TMO to decide? And Mr. Todd's answer at line 15, I think he was working alongside the client, so it was probably a reasonable question to ask. The problem is, I'm not sure what mitigation measures you could really implement. You would want it fixed as soon as possible, but you wouldn't go to a waking watch, I suggest. So it's very difficult to come up with mitigation measures for a non-functioning or not adequately functioning smoke control system.
Yeah.
Do you agree with Mr. Todd's evidence there?
I recognise the difficulty. I suppose I have to say I'm kind of deliberately not answering your question because the answer to that question has become so pertinent to the extra work I've been asked to do. So I don't want to go through a big list today.
Well, I'm not going to push you to do that.
Is that okay? But to have a control measure to maintain compartmentation in a high-rise residential building with a broken smoke control system is difficult unless one can, for example, I'll just give one example now, physically lock down. If there was a way to go and physically force close the AOVs and be satisfied, maybe they were able to offer some help limit smoke spread in the event of a fire, okay? But that may have been very difficult to Grenfell Tower. I'm not saying that I think Mr. Stokes should have immediately instigated a waking watch, no, so I understand Mr. Todd's view, okay? So I think it was an incredibly difficult thing to mitigate, and hence by making such a serious decision to maintain the risk level at tolerable was a very big decision. So I have to assume there was some considerable thought made into the control measures that allowed the risk level not to change at all when that system couldn't work.
And does it come to I'm not going to ask you
Yeah.
about matters which are still under preparation.
Yes.
And on this topic, we will come back to you in Module 7.
Exactly. I have to answer that question then. Yes.
That's absolutely fine, to be clear with you.
Yeah.
But do I take from your last answer
Yes.
that given the difficulties you've identified,
Yes.
Mr. Todd's identified, to be fair to him,
Yes.
the reasonable fire risk assessor would revisit the calibration of the risk for the building?
Absolutely. Completely agree. Yeah.
Yes. Now, perhaps before I leave this, and again, if this is a Module 7 issue, please tell me. But can I show you what the action plan said? CST 403177 at page 8. And if we go to line 19D, you can see, this is, to be clear, 2014, you can see that he says, under the priority high, the contractor's ridings are going to be working to upgrade the installed smoke extraction system on the flat straight lift lobby areas and the refuse chute rooms of this building. Can it be actions to be taken? Can it please be confirmed what compensatory measures are being put in place, etc., etc.? And I've shown you that in passage in the transcript of Mr. Todd's evidence because I read it to him. My question is, was that a reasonable approach for a fire risk assessor to take?
Yeah, so just looking at that row, the responsible person knows, there's a problem and the risk assessor is talking about compensatory measures. But the intrinsic flaw in how Mr. Stokes dealt with risk level is where the next step is where the failure comes in, okay?
Yes.
So he has very correctly here asked, he's asked the right question, okay? And he's put it into his action plan, which was used by the KCTMO.
Yes.
The problem is just, as he consistently did, he never changed the risk level as a result of, say, big questions or big issues like this he raised. Some of the issues he raised were very minor, but some of them could have had a substantial impact on the risk of life. And so his risk level needed to change until the responsible person satisfied him that it was acceptable to bring that risk level down. Okay, so it's that flaw in the system, in the whole way his risk assessments, in conjunction with the KCTMO, didn't tackle risk properly.
Yes, I see. So to summarise that, I think, and to move on, it's your opinion, I think, that although there's nothing wrong with the action taken, which is a demand for a confirmation of compensatory measures, unless and until Mr. Stokes received adequate confirmation, he should have upgraded his risk calibration for the building.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Agree. Yeah.
Now, can we go to the FRA itself, to which this document relates, and that's at CST 403157 at page 29. We're still in the 2014 period. This is the 17th of October 2014 template he used. This is part 23, testing and maintenance. And if you look, fifth question down, it says, is there a monthly testing and annual servicing and maintenance of any automatic opening vents along with any associated equipment, devices with records kept?
Yeah.
And there's no, the box is ticked no there. You can see that. He ticks the box no. But there's no commentary in the box, in the observation box. And there's no issue raised in the action plan.
No.
And that one can see that from a glance at the document. In your opinion, did that affect the suitability and sufficiency of the FRA?
Yes, because if you look at the screen here, he's actually raised testing and maintenance is ticked as no for the detection and alarm, the emergency lighting, the vents, the dry riser. Okay, it's nearly everything. That might be a bit of I'm just paraphrasing now. So nearly every protective measure in the building under testing and maintenance He has ticked no. And I think that any risk assessor would step back and observe the scale of the number of no's and realise that there is a fire risk management system problem, and that it needs to, it is relevant to the resulting risk level until it's closed out satisfactorily.
Thank you. When it came to April 2016,
Yeah.
and Mr. Stokes' FRA then, Mr. Stokes, I mean, do you agree with the fact that he didn't explain whether the newly installed AOV, we come to it, was operational or not? He didn't do that. Would you agree that that's something that he should have identified clearly in his fire risk assessment?
Yeah. So theoretically, because I'm dealing with this very, in detail in, I think you called it Module 7. So theoretically, again, I think I said this yesterday, as a minimum, because I don't expect a fire risk assessor is not responsible for, the quality of the system delivered during a refurbishment. But as a minimum, and that's what Regulation 38 is all about, some simple information on, the purpose of the smoke control system in the tower, etc. He needed to satisfy himself through what should have been available basic information in Grenfell Tower. I have to be fair to him that even if he had, and he did actually raise issues around Regulation 38, that information wasn't available to him in the format it should have been, in my opinion. And I think we're getting just a bit, yeah.
And you covered that in another report.
Yeah, exactly.
And if need be, you can come back to that at Module 10.
Exactly. I can be much clearer when we have finally established the purpose of the device installed in Grenfell Tower during the primary refurbishment, which I'm back looking at again. I can give a fairer assessment of what the minimum expected from Mr. Stokes.
Thank you. Can I then turn to a completely different topic, which is cladding?
Cladding. Yeah.
We've already touched on the question of the exterior wall and its role or otherwise in the RRO. But can I start with your report at Chapter 10, BLARP 25032, page 97. And I'm going to show you two paragraphs on that page, paragraph 9.7.4, 14 and 15, towards the bottom of the page. At 9.7.14, you say this: overall, with respect to Mr. Stokes, the record of information in accordance with Article 9 of the RRFSO, by means of his fire risk assessment for Grenfell Tower, incorrectly described the hazard the external wall posed by categorising the cladding performance as fire rated when it was not. And then 9.5.15, the fire risk assessment omitted significant components of the external wall, such as the insulation and infill panels, the insulating core panels, which were formed with combustible materials, and so Mr. Stokes significantly underestimated the hazard the external wall posed. Now, overall, would you say that the assessment of the fire performance of the cladding at Grenfell Tower was within or outside Mr. Stokes' competence?
Oh, within or outside his competence?
His actual competence?
His actual competence? Well, I have to say no.
Outside?
Yes, it was outside his competence by means of the facts. I've set out the evidence in my report about what information he had available to him and how he described performance, and that doesn't demonstrate competence, in my opinion.
Now, in your experience, is the assessment of the fire performance of the external wall construction, particularly of a high-rise residential building, typically beyond the competence of a fire risk assessor?
Okay, so we're getting into very general and very controversial territory there. So I just want to say a few things first. So at Grenfell Tower, the fire risk assessor took the decision in 2014 to raise the cladding as a hazard in his risk assessment. Okay, and then in 2016, it was taken out of the hazard list and put into a statement of performance. And I have given my opinions on that basis, that the risk assessor made that decision to incorporate it into the hazards he considered in his in his statutory fire risk assessment. I am very uncomfortable to give big sweeping statement about such a controversial subject and the competency of a whole profession today.
Well, I am asking you to,
I know
to
you
do
are.
that.
I know. Well, I just very uncomfortable.
Well, let me try.
Giving, it's a bit anecdotal, isn't it? If I tell you what I think about that.
Well, that may be, but
Yeah.
let me try it this way.
Well, can I answer your question a different way? I don't think a risk assessor remember the duty to not provide hazardous external walls lies with we'll just call it the design team and the people who hand over the wall in the first place. I've been very clear about that in my report. And I don't want to be unfair on, people who carry out fire risk assessments in that context, because that appears to be the context we're operating in.
Let me see if I can get to this another way and see if you can help me with this. Can I ask you, please, to be shown Mr. Todd's main report at CTA 6011, at page 22. Can we look, please, together at what he says at paragraph 3.17 in the middle of your screen? He says, moreover, in my experience, the assessment of the fire performance of external wall construction is quite specialised, beyond the competence of typical fire risk assessors and fire and rescue service fire safety officers, and often incapable of informed opinion purely on the basis of a visual inspection. Intrusive inspection involving destructive exposure and sometimes testing of materials might be necessary. Again, this opinion is widely held within the fire safety profession and is supported by the FIA guidance to which I referred in the previous paragraph. And my question is, do you agree with what Mr. Todd has written there?
No, I think it's like everything. There's different levels of competency, different levels of understanding. I mean, there's a few things here, again, all terribly controversial subjects that are being discussed at length outside the inquiry. So I just want to go back to the whole point of Regulation 38 was that there would be a fire strategy that confirmed accurately the performance of the materials used in the external wall and confirmed that they together could adequately resist the spread of fire over the wall, okay, as it's set out in the building regulations. So you shouldn't have to carry out an intrusive inspection as a matter of course on any building.
I wonder if you can help a little bit further if we break this down. If you look at what Mr. Todd says in paragraph 317, first thing he says is, the assessment of the fire performance of external wall construction is quite specialised. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think you have to have a thorough understanding of materials, and you know that I have been waylaid into such matters like that. I've told you that on whenever we started on Tuesday. But can I just be clear? I'm not the only person around who has that skill, and there are fire risk assessors in this country who have that skill.
Well, maybe there are, but I'm just trying to take this by stages because I think it would help us all to know where you part from Mr. Todd and where you don't. So his view is the assessment of the fire performance of an external wall construction is quite specialised, and I think you said you would agree with that.
I would.
And then he expresses the view that it's beyond the competence of a typical fire risk inspector. Now, there may be some who have more technical knowledge than others, but would you agree that it's beyond the skill of a typical fire risk assessor?
I think where I think what you say divert from Mr. Todd is I just don't think it's appropriate to give very generalised answers in an expert environment like here about a subject that has such significant consequences right now. The typical fire risk assessor should not have to carry out an inspection.
I quite understand why you say that.
That's as far as...
But the question I think that you're being asked to consider is, and you've met a lot of fire risk assessors in your time, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
How many of them would have the specialist skill to assess the fire performance?
Some of
an
them
external
wouldn't.
wall?
Some of them wouldn't. Some of them wouldn't.
Well, many of them wouldn't? Well, if you can't say, then just tell.
Well, it's more. I don't want to be. It's like judgmental as opposed to an expert opinion. I think you have asked a lot about competence, and we've discussed whether there's a requirement to have certain levels of competence or not. And, I'm probably aware it's an issue in the fire risk assessor profession, but because remember, a lot of people would consider me to be a fire engineer, though I don't consider myself to be one anymore. And I think there are similar issues generally in the fire safety profession. I think what I'm trying to say is I don't want to focus on fire risk assessors only when it comes to being asked an opinion about how external walls have been treated. Okay, it's unfair to single out, say, one aspect of the whole circle of professions that are meant to contribute to that aspect of safety. I don't want to single out fire risk assessors.
All right. Now, the third thing Mr. Todd says here, which I'd welcome your reaction to, is that the assessment of the fire performance of an external wall is often not possible purely on the basis of visual inspection. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think depending on the wall type.
Yeah.
So some walls actually are quite easy to, you can but there are certain wall types. I think I'm going to say this out loud, particularly formed with ACP, where to form a view purely based on what you see is, it could be incredibly unreliable. Yeah. Okay.
Well, it would seem to me, and tell me if you think this is right or wrong, that if you have a composite panel as a cladding, you can't tell from a visual inspection what the nature of the core is.
Exactly.
And how that core will perform. So
absolutely. But
I think you would agree with what Mr. Todd says in that respect.
But then I think it's such a dangerous subject because of the consequences. But the cladding, so the panel, and then as we've covered at length here, what's behind it together, so for a fire risk assessor, they are entitled to, through Regulation 38, that basic information. These are the cavity barriers and we install them properly. Here's the insulation and it is what we were meant to do. And this is the cladding and I've given you a truthful record of its performance in fire, okay? It's not any fire risk assessor's fault if there's a whole system delivering to them either incorrect or absent information. And that's why I don't want to criticise fire risk assessors.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
That's helpful. So back to you, Mr. Bennett.
Yes. What would a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment of the external cladding system at Grenfell Tower have involved?
So when Mr. Stokes made the decision to incorporate the cladding into his risk assessment, so I haven't judged him on a theoretical situation. So to summarise what I said in my report, as far as I'm concerned, he should have read the fire strategy to understand what the materials were. And before he declared it fire rated, which is a specific performance description, he needed to have information about the basic products used in the external wall to allow him to make that statement. He made that statement. Many of us before Grenfell would not have made that statement.
Now, what would you have expected Mr. Stokes to have known about RS 5000, Renabon PE 55, and the Lamatherm cavity barriers? Those are the basic products.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, how do I answer that question now? Because we know. So I have to bring myself. Do you mean bring myself back to 2016 in the apparently innocent days of looking at materials, and he before he wrote the phrase fire rated, he needed to have a document that told him the performance of the external surface, the performance of the insulation, and because a decision had been taken to use those infill panels as well, he needed to know their fire performance also. So to really, I'm going to say really basic, there's this product, and I have honestly confirmed to you it has this fire performance, just very basic.
So
the use of the performance definitions, for example, in approved document B, at just a very basic level.
I see.
Okay.
And that is it your opinion, building on that answer, that you would have expected Mr. Stokes, as the putatively reasonably competent fire risk assessor, to have obtained the basic product information, perhaps some basic plans, and at least satisfied himself from that he could say that they were, quotes, fire rated, based on the information contained in those documents and approved document B.
When Mr. Stokes, as a fire risk assessor who decided to categorise the cladding at Grenfell Tower as fire rated, he needed to know. I'm not familiar with Mr. Stokes' ability to read plans or anything, so I wasn't going to get into that level of detail, but that he knew the formal fire performance of the core components of the wall when he took the decision to write fire rated.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but what do you understand by the use of the expression fire rated?
Yeah, and that's the whole problem. So in a fire rated wall is a wall with fire resisting properties. So it's like a compartment wall. They're extremely unusual. And you normally have a fire rated wall in a part of an external wall because it's too close to a neighbouring building.
But, I mean, the reason I asked the question is because it seemed to me to beg the further question, rated to what level?
Exactly.
Or, I mean, does it have an established meaning? Yeah. And if so, what is it?
Yeah, so, you know, in the last while, I've heard you all talk a lot about this thing about, you know, people escaping past an external wall, and there's rules for fire resistance in that area when you're forced to walk past a wall. And when two buildings are very close together, there's rules about fire resistance. That's totally different to the whole issue at Grenfell Tower about reaction to fire, okay? So fire resistance is that classic furnace test. It's a different type of heating regime. And typically fire ratings come in timed periods, 30, 60, 90, 120 minutes, okay? That's what fire rated means.
But in that case, does it make any sense just to describe a wall, in this case, as fire rated without attaching any time to it?
It doesn't. It doesn't. it's a terrible, it's an inaccurate representation of the performance of the wall. And because I don't want to translate this out to lots of other buildings. So at Grenfell Tower, the risk assessor raised the cladding as a hazard in his risk assessment, and then he removed that as a hazard from his action plan and made it a statement of performance. Very, very, very specific activity.
And if Mr. Stokes did not have, or did not feel he had, the expertise and experience to read the basic product data for the basic elements of the cladding system at Grenfell Tower, so as to be able to express an opinion about its fire performance, using a neutral word, what would you have expected Mr. Stokes to have done?
To not have changed from raising it as a hazard into a performance statement. He should never have done that, in my opinion. But obviously, anyway, in my opinion.
And does that mean that he should simply have left it as a hazard and left it to the TMO to seek specialist independent advice?
That was one option available to them, yes.
Right. And what other options would be available to him if he didn't feel he had the experience and expertise?
Oh, sorry, because I'm just thinking, I was thinking probably a little too much, because even if Mr. Stokes and Miss Ray had decided to get the information to allow any person make that statement about fire rating, remember, I've told you that even if they had opened up the building manual, and I found no evidence that they did, the information in there was in itself problematic. I've dealt with that at length already. So you were not in a position anyway to form an accurate view on the fire performance of the external wall. So we're in multiple layers of inadequate descriptions of the fire performance, and so missing, as a result, terribly, the hazard the wall posed.
Now, if we look at let's look at the 2016 FRAs if we can. Can we go please to the April 2016 FRA, and let's look at the words he actually used. I'm conscious that we've been having this discussion without the document in front of us. It would be helpful, I think, to see it. CST 403161, page 4, first paragraph. This is April 2016 FRA, but it's also in the June version as well. He says here, under description of the building, sorry, it's just above the words, description of the building, top of the screen. New external cladding has been fitted to this building as part of the project of refurbishment / construction being undertaken on and within this building. The original external face of this building has been overclad. The new fire-rated cladding is fixed to the outface of the building by metal fixings, and the whole process has been overseen by the RBKC Building Control Department and officers. They have approved and accepted the fixing system and cladding used. Now, Mr. Stokes accepted in his evidence when he gave it to us that at the time he wrote that statement, he hadn't seen any building control documentation or any other independent information, and that it was based on an informal conversation with a representative from Ryden, Dave Hughes, as it turns out, and also a conversation that he'd had with the TMO. Just for our reference, that's day 139, page 72, line 25 to 75, line 25, and day 139, page 71, line 8, and 73, line 9. I'm just reading that into the transcript so we can find it later. That's his evidence. My question to you is, would you expect a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to make those unqualified and unequivocal statements in his fire risk assessment about cladding without having seen and analysed for himself any underlying objective basis for them?
No, and I don't think anything should be written in the statutory risk assessment that is not accurate or proven to be accurate.
Now, in your report, at Chapter 11, paragraph 28.1.3, at BLARP 250's 40, page 86, and there's no need to go to it, you described his doing so as professionally reckless behaviour.
Yes, I did say that.
I just want to understand what you mean by professionally reckless.
Yeah.
Do you mean that he didn't care one way or the other whether the cladding was or wasn't, as he called it, fire rated, or simply that he failed to take reasonable care to check that it was indeed
I don't.
fire
It's
rated?
none of my business about caring. That's not relevant to my work. It was reckless because, as I've been saying to you all along, and we know that the issue of external wall even being in a risk assessment is you call it a matter of controversy, I think. So when Mr. Stokes himself took the decision to raise it as a hazard and took the decision to remove it as a hazard and made it a statement of performance without any information or attempting to read information to put himself in that position, I think that was reckless, that action from hazard up to statement of performance with no information.
Would you expect a competent fire risk assessor to assume, on the basis of building control oversight and approval alone, that a cladding system complied with the building regulations?
No.
And would perform its requirements in terms of fire protection and not as a hazard?
No.
Would a statement to that effect in an FRA constitute the actual carrying out of a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment?
A statement to the effect that building control have overseen the works?
Yes.
Mr. Stokes doesn't know what building control did when they were overseeing the works.
Yes. And can you explain why a competent fire risk assessor should not proceed on the assumption that just because building control have signed it off, it was compliant?
Oh, signed it off. I'm sympathetic in the sense it should be compliant if it's been signed off, okay? So we're back to all these theoretical hypotheticals that we're going through at length at this inquiry. We know that there are problems. So I understand there was a time when, and people cite that even now, well, building control said it was okay. That's very common use. But in terms of the statutory risk assessment, okay, I don't think it's sufficient to make a remark. I'm not aware that Mr. Stokes was privy to the workings of building control on this project at all. And it would be more suitable when he took the decision to say what he did, that he had independently found some other piece of information that allowed him to be sure.
What I'm really trying to get is whether his simply proceeding on an assumption that building control had signed it off.
No, it's not. You can't do that.
And when you say you can't do that, does the effect of not doing that mean that his fire risk assessment of the cladding was not suitable and sufficient?
His fire risk assessment of the cladding not being suitable and sufficient isn't to do with building control. It's to do with him giving it a fire performance he had no evidence it had. Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes, that makes sense. Can I just see if I can reformulate it and see if you agree? That Mr. Stokes, in saying that that the cladding was fire rated without any objective underlying evidence analysed by him with which to make that statement, meant that his assessment as such was not suitable and sufficient.
I agree.
Thank you. And as such, did he fall below the standards expected of a reasonably competent fire risk assessor?
He fell below the standards of a risk assessor who decided to incorporate the cladding into their risk assessment.
Now, let's move forward in the story. We get to April 2017, and I think you're familiar with the letter from Assistant Commissioner Dan Daly to the various London councils. We've seen the version of the 6th of April to Laura Johnson already. That came to Mr. Stokes on the 19th of April 2017, and he was asked by Janice Ray to confirm that the TMO did not have any external cladding on blocks of the nature described in the letter. let's go to the email we looked at, I think, a little earlier. It's at CST 403112. Can we please go to page 1 and look at the foot of that page? Mr. Stokes is sent an email from Janice Ray on the 24th. This is at the end of the email chain after the initial sending of the letter on the 19th of April to him. And at the bottom of page 1, you can see that Janice Ray writes to Mr. Stokes on the 24th of April and says, Carl, my understanding is we do not have any blocks with external cladding of this nature. Are you able to confirm, please? I need to write back to the Director of Housing, and I think you're probably best placed to advise me on the construction of our blocks. And the same day, Mr. Stokes comes back to her, 3 hours or so later, and says, as far as I know, that is correct. Grenfell was clad, but the cladding complied with the requirements of the building regulations. Lots of questions asked of Rydens and answers received back from them. And that's where the exchange essentially ends. Given Mr. Stokes's qualifications and education and experience, was the statement the cladding complied with the requirements of the building regulations one which he was actually qualified to make?
No, it wasn't.
And in doing so, did he depart from the normally accepted standards in the fire risk assessment trade, do you think?
He departed from the acceptable standards of a person providing safety advice. Be
Right.
good to have a break soon now. Yeah.
Would that be a good moment, Mr. Smith?
It would be an excellent.
If I'd appreciate that. Yeah.
Yes, it would.
We'll stop there and come back at 11:30, please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, 11:30. Thank you very much. Yes, would you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Dr. Lane, happy to carry on?
Yeah.
Good. If you get to a stage when you think you need another break,
Yes.
would you indicate?
Yeah, I will do. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes, Mr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'd like now to turn to the topic with you of fire risk management.
Yes.
It's something we've touched on quite a lot over the last 2 days.
Yes.
Can we start with the Salvus Fire Safety Management Report of the 22nd of September 2009, and we'll find that at SAL 6013. Now, I take it from me that this document was sent to Mr. Stokes on the 28th of September 2010, shortly after he won the tender for the medium risk programme
Yes.
buildings at the TMO. We don't need to look at the email, although just for our reference purposes, as a reminder, it's CST 404383. Now, looking at the report at page 5, if we can turn to that, you can see that it identifies a number of statutory breaches. There were 19 statutory breaches
Yes.
in all, relating to the TMO's fire safety management at that time, September 2009. Would you have expected Mr. Stokes, coming in a year later, to have satisfied himself that those deficiencies had been remedied by the time he had been formally appointed the fire risk assessor for the medium risk buildings?
Yes, I would. Yeah.
You would.
Yes.
And would you have expected him at least to have investigated with the TMO what steps they were taking to carry those recommendations into effect?
Yes, because it was quite a formative document with all sorts of different actions, and he needed to know they were closed out when establishing his own risk levels in each one of the properties.
Yes.
Reliant on that management system.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Todd said that he would not have expected Mr. Stokes to use this report as a checklist, but to, as he put it, start with a clean sheet of paper and determine for himself whether the management standards were adequate. Day 168, page 70, lines 2 to 9. Do you agree with that?
Why did Mr. Todd think it could be ignored?
Well, do you agree with his statement?
No, I don't at
Thank
all.
you.
But I don't understand why he thought it could be ignored. I don't agree it can be ignored.
You don't agree that it could
Yeah.
be ignored. Now, looking at page 13 in this, please, can we go to the first of the deficiencies identified by Salvus? That was the absence of a TMO fire safety policy statement, as you can see there. And you can see in the first row the recommendation by Salvus as follows. It is strongly recommended that an overall TMO fire safety policy statement is developed, setting out the organisation's strategic fire safety objectives.
Yeah.
The statement includes a clear reference to achieving full compliance with the requirements of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, wherever it applies to premises managed and or occupied by the TMO.
Yeah.
That the statement is signed by and formally endorsed by the Chief Executive on behalf of the TMO.
Yeah.
That's the first recommendation. And if you look at the second recommendation, in the if you look at the second row,
Yeah.
it also, the second recommendation, strongly advised that adequate policy and supporting
Yes.
arrangements were introduced to explain how the TMO will meet the objectives set out in the strategic policy statement, so as to ensure suitable and sufficient fire safety is maintained at all times throughout the managed estate.
Yeah.
Would you have expected Mr. Stokes to have sought and reviewed a copy of the TMO's fire safety strategy or policy, to the extent that there was one at that time, of course,
Yes.
before carrying out fire risk assessments for the TMO?
Exactly. If it had existed, which it didn't,
Yeah.
he should have reviewed it. Or asked for it and then reviewed it.
And can you give us very briefly a reason why that document would have been extremely helpful to him in carrying out his functions?
Because the risk level produced in a building as such is a function of the fire risk management system. So you have to understand the intentions of the fire risk management system and how it's being set up, and so which parts of it you can rely on when you're carrying out your risk assessment in a building. Yeah, sorry.
No, sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah.
Can we go to CST 401822, please? This is a letter from Mr. Stokes that we've seen a number of times before to Janice Ray on the 23rd of June 2010.
Yeah.
And it followed a meeting they'd had on the day before, the 22nd of June 2010,
Yeah.
relating to employee fire safety training, PEEPS.
Yeah.
and the lift maintenance policy in TMO buildings.
Yes.
And if you look at the second paragraph, he said this: when completing any fire risk assessments for buildings under the control of the Tenants Management Organisation, TMO, of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in future, and where TMO employees are present in the buildings, the information in this letter will be used as the basis of the fire training and fire warden section of the document. You can see that's what he said there. And if we go to another letter, before I come to a question, CST 403061, this is his letter of the 27th of September 2010 to Janice Ray, following their meeting on the 24th of September 2010. He says, after the meeting, in the second line, I would like to put in writing the management procedures and topics we discussed, and issues, etc., we discussed, so that when completing any fire risk assessments for residential buildings under the control of the Tenants Management Organisation, TMO of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in future, these standards and observations will apply. The letter then went on to cover a number of matters, and you can see them listed under employee fire training and thereafter. You can see them there. I'm not going to read the list out to you. Now, I want to come to what you say about that in your report. Can we look, please, at BLARP 25040, page 47. And this is within chapter 11 of your report at paragraph 18.1.8, under the general heading, Mr. Stokes' approach to the arrangements made by the KCTMO for maintenance. And at subparagraph 8, about three-quarters of the way down the page, halfway now down your screen, it says this: the short letter produced by Mr. Stokes is, in my opinion, not a thorough assessment of KCTMO's fire risk management system, especially in light of the fact that the KCTMO's portfolio of buildings comprised of just under 7,000 homes, more than 2,500 leasehold properties. You cite from the KCTMO Asset Management Strategy 2014 to 19, dated May 2015, and there's the reference there. Why do you consider that this letter was not a thorough assessment of the TMO's fire risk management system?
Well, I hope the letter speaks for itself, but say taking one particular item to be clearer, you showed us there that Salva said to have the formal fire safety strategy document even. That's before you even get to policy and procedures. And, I mean, that didn't exist when Mr. Stokes wrote that letter, if I've got my dates correct. It didn't, It just simply... So I don't know how, in the absence of documents that are needed as part of a fire risk management strategy and already advised as being missing and significant and a statutory breach, writing a simple letter... well, anyway, I won't go on, but that letter doesn't reflect the kind of reviewing work needed.
Would you have expected Mr. Stokes to carry out an assessment of the TMO's overall fire risk management system at the outset of his contract to undertake fire risk assessments in the TMO's medium risk properties? Yeah,
I have to say I would. So if you're going to take on a job of that scale, it wasn't one building, taking on a job of that scale... Obviously, I think the documentation should have been there, so it wasn't a deeply complex task, okay? But yes, to take on fire risk assessments at that scale, I would expect a review of the fire risk management system.
And why was that, very briefly?
Because everything, I think, because in terms of, so the fire, in terms of, say, there's all sorts of reasons, and I've been through them at length in the report, but just giving some specifics here. So before you start, even knowing what protective measures are being relied upon in each building, so the record, the general fire precautions, what exists in the building, then what are the plans in place to maintain them at an adequate performance level, who in the organisation is responsible for what, just that level of clarity about how everything that enables one to rely on general fire precautions, how it will be dealt with day by day. And all of that impacts the risk level of any building.
Thank you.
Okay.
Now, going to BLARP 25027, which is chapter 8 of your report. Can we
Yeah.
please look at that at page 209? And you say at paragraph 9.10.15,
Yeah.
page 209. Yes, it's on the screen now. You say, I have also seen no evidence from any other year that Mr. Stokes specifically asked Miss Ray to provide him with any updated information regarding the fire risk management system.
Yeah.
And you go on to say in the next two paragraphs, therefore, I've also seen no evidence that Mr. Stokes adequately assessed KCTMO's overall fire risk management system, either as a separate piece of work or as part of his individual fire risk assessment reports for Grenfell Tower. Instead, based on the evidence provided to me, Mr. Stokes appears to have assumed that the initial information he agreed with Miss Ray in September 2010 was the basis of management of fire risk in KCTMO properties at all subsequent times.
Yeah.
Now, can we take it from those three paragraphs there that you would have expected Mr. Stokes to have obtained and assessed up-to-date, current information about the general fire safety management matters set out in the September 2010 letter when carrying out any fire risk assessment for a particular building?
Yeah. So, for example, when the fire strategy did come into formal existence that was 2013. For a risk assessor responsible for so many properties, I think a review of that document to make sure it had sufficiently described the arrangements being made, because the arrangements are an article in the order. It had sufficiently described things for you, or if there were performances or other issues you weren't clear on having read that document. And a good illustration of that is you showed me earlier the table with all the different systems ticked no when it came to testing and maintenance. So that's connected back to the understanding of the fire risk management system and the organisational arrangements planned and then implemented to make sure those boxes are not no. That's why it's interconnected and the review is so important.
In not obtaining and assessing up-to-date information about the general fire safety management matters,
yes,
as set out in the September 2010 letter when he came into the contract at that time, did Mr. Stokes fall short of acceptable standards?
Yes, and yes, he did. Yes,
He did.
Yeah.
And when he took on the entirety of the TMO portfolio the following year,
Yes.
October 2011, at that stage, should he also, again, have obtained and assessed up-to-date information about the...
Yes,
fire risk?
sorry, I thought you were actually talking about that year. So when he took on the entirety of the portfolio, it was particularly relevant.
Particularly relevant,
Yes.
but relevant even in 2010 as well.
It's relevant generally, but the greater the scale of the property, the more intimate you need to be, the portfolio, the more intimate you need to be with the workings of the fire risk management system.
Yes, thank you.
Is that okay? So it's an increasing responsibility, if you want to put it that way.
Would you also have expected Mr. Stokes to have obtained and assessed premises-specific information about general fire safety management matters in 2010? When carrying out...
2010. Can I just clarify, are you asking me about 2010 because it's the first fire risk assessment he carried out? Is that the difference you're trying to winkle out of me?
No, what I'm trying to winkle out of you is that it is in 2010 when he is given the programme by the TMO after the tender exercise, based on the consultant's brief of July 2010.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but why? Yes, okay.
And it is in September 2010 that he addresses fire safety management issues in the letter we've seen.
Yes.
Before that, as we know, he did a fire risk assessment at the end of September 2009 when still employed or retained by Salvus.
Who and in that entity, they carried out a very thorough review of the fire risk.
I'm excluding the 2009 fire risk assessment for the purposes of this question. So go from 2010.
Okay, so in 2010, when Mr. Stokes was asked to carry out fire risk assessments on multiple properties, is that what you're asking me?
Correct.
Yes, he did need to review the fire risk management system.
Yes, but for building, but my question is,
Yeah.
should he have done so on a premises-specific basis, building by building, when carrying out a fire risk assessment for a particular building? In other words, should he have, when confronted with a building for which he was doing a fire risk assessment, asked himself or asked the TMO, what are the fire risk management systems for this building?
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, I mean, that's what you're doing in a way, but... Sorry, I have to be clear so I don't give the wrong answer. Are you talking about the specific individuals responsible, or are you asking me about how the risk management system is being implemented in that building?
The latter.
The latter. So by carrying out the risk assessment and assessing the quality of what you find in the building, in a way, that's what you are doing.
And do you criticise Mr. Stokes for not doing that?
But so I think we're talking across purposes. So he did look at systems and how they were being implemented. I'm not sure that we're speaking about the same thing.
Right, well, let's leave it at that. We've already covered Grenfell Tower specifically, and I think we've already got your opinions about, particularly in relation to box ticking and no on that.
Yeah.
Can we look at Annex E of PAS 79 and look at this from a slightly different angle? This is at CTA 703, page 106. This is the model pro forma, and I take into account what you've told us about pro formas.
Yeah.
It's the model pro forma for review of an existing fire risk assessment.
Yeah.
So you can see it's informative. And if you look at page 111, please, a little bit further on in the document, you can see that there's a section within it on management of fire safety.
Yeah.
That's the heading. And paragraph 13.1 has a heading and a box. And the heading says, significant changes in management of fire safety since the time of the fire risk assessment. Now, just pausing there, do you agree that that suggests that up-to-date information on fire safety management matters should be obtained by the fire risk assessor when carrying out a fire risk assessment review?
Yeah. So actually, I understand what you've been trying to ask me about now. So if you look at this box, okay, and apply it to the Grenfell Tower risk assessment we looked at earlier, the over a period of years, the significant changes in the management of fire safety since the last time I carried out the fire risk assessment is I asked them to sort out routine inspections in the building. There has been no change, despite me raising it as an action. That's the type of information you'd write there about the management.
Right.
Does that make sense? So
yes.
the evidence of the management you find in the building and how it relates back to the procedures and the organisational arrangements you'd explain here. So I can't find evidence there's routine inspections. When I look at certain things, they're not working, though I'm being reassured they're being checked.
Yes.
There's that's how you would deal with management.
Right. In fact,
okay? Yeah.
But I think that may answer the question under the next box.
Yeah.
Because 13.1 is significant changes in
Exactly.
management of fire safety. You might not find a change. You might find that it's the same old.
Exactly.
Poor
there
management.
hasn't been a significant change, though I asked for one
Right.
to be,
Right. But I would suggest to you that would be more adequately answered under 14.1. It doesn't matter because the point is the same. But are arrangements for management of fire safety adequate? Presumably you would say no, because the last time I asked for something, it wasn't done.
Yeah, so the significant change is I asked for the following to take place. It still hasn't occurred. And the consequences are, if we refer back to that box, with all the systems with no, I'm afraid I now have to conclude that the arrangements for management of fire safety in the tower in that year is no on the basis of the following, and you'd refer back to items found in the fire risk assessment.
Now just looking at 14.1, can you help us? What assessment is envisaged would be carried out by a fire risk assessor in response to this question?
In terms of 14.1?
Yes.
It's as I've described. What you've witnessed in terms of the quality of what you're seeing in the building, because the quality of that is what the fire risk management system is meant to provide.
Now, Mr. Stokes didn't include these sections in any of his fire risk assessments for Grenfell Tower after his first assessment that he did for Salvus in 2009.
Yeah.
My question to you is, would you have expected him to have included them in his fire risk assessments he did once he'd been retained by the TMO?
Yes, I would, because it's a really clear way of bringing that other element of risk control clearly to the attention of the responsible person.
And can you just explain the importance of considering these sections, 13.1 and 13.2, in a fire risk assessment review?
Do you mean, are you saying review in the context of not carrying out a full fire risk assessment?
That's, I think, what Annex E is
Okay,
about.
so I just wanted to be clear. Well, anyway, if for review, the best way of understanding the condition of the management, as I've been saying, is particularly looking at how the significant actions and findings are being dealt with in the last full risk assessment. I've been trying to explain they're a manifestation of the success of your fire risk management system.
Can I just then perhaps break that down a little bit? What we've been looking at is the FRAs done by Mr. Stokes in 2010, 2012, 2014 and twice in 2016.
Yeah.
Those were new FRAs. I would leave aside the June 2016 one for the moment. Those were new FRAs, and not reviews of existing FRAs.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, would you expect Mr. Stokes to have attempted to answer the questions posed at 13.1 and 14.1 here?
Yes, I understand this is in a pro forma for review.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Leaving aside the pro forma, the concept of being clear on the quality of your observations of the management system in each building is relevant to a full and review activity.
And if the responsible person conducted its own review in-house, would you have expected the responsible person to have asked itself these questions and answered them fully, candidly and properly?
Yeah, I'm not aware that happened, though.
No, indeed. Would you have expected?
Would you mean theoretically, would I expect a manager to assess themselves in their management of fire safety?
Well, that is the premise of the question.
Yeah.
If a responsible person conducts its own review of the FRA done for it by a fire risk assessor in year one.
Yeah, so...
Or year two, rather, after year one.
Obviously, I would expect someone who decides to... I feel like I'm kind of stating the obvious. If you take the decision to use this pro forma, yes, I think you should fill it in properly.
Leaving aside the pro forma, as a matter of principle, would you expect a responsible person, when reviewing the fire risk assessment done for it by a fire risk assessor the year after it was done, to have addressed the questions at 13.1 and 14.1, even though they're in a pro forma there?
Yeah, I think I really don't think... I don't really understand what you mean, okay? So the fire risk management system is a set of organisational arrangements that produces something in a building, okay? So I see this review pro forma here is a review of what's been found in the building the last time the risk assessment was done. That's what I see here, okay?
Yes.
I think we're talking about two separate things.
I wonder if I can help. I think
Yeah.
what Mr. Millett is asking you is, if the responsible person decided to conduct the review assessment for himself, or for itself, would you expect it to ask these sort of questions of itself and to ensure that the system was running properly?
Yeah, I think so. But in this review mode, it has to be off the basis of some findings in the last fire risk assessment, which would mean the documentation in whatever form has set out matters that allow you to review them and so fill in these boxes. if the fire risk assessment for that property has no mention of the relevance of management, I don't know how you can fill in this particular form.
Yes. Now, if Mr. Stokes did not assess significant changes in fire safety management in his subsequent fire risk assessments for Grenfell Tower, would you criticise him?
Can you just say that?
Yes. If Mr. Stokes did not, in fact, assess significant changes, or the absence of required changes, perhaps, in his subsequent fire risk assessments for Grenfell Tower, having raised a management question or an issue which impinged on management, would you criticise him?
I would. Can I just go back? I think you're asking me if a competent person who has designed and is responsible for a fire risk management system, irrespective of what the fire risk assessor is doing, if they are responsible for checking that the arrangements they've put in place are both complying with the order and delivering what's required in each building, and they're doing that as part of this particular type of review, the answer is yes, I would expect them to do that as the responsible person.
Thank you. Now, can we look at PAS 79, CTA 703, page 50, and I'd like just to examine clause 16 of it with you for a moment. If we look at subparagraph 1 on the left-hand side of the page, under general, it says, in the fire risk assessment, fire safety management, C 3.47, needs to be regarded as of equal importance to fire protection measures. In its broadest sense, fire safety management includes certain policies and procedures designed to prevent the occurrence of fire by eliminating or controlling fire hazards. However, most of these aspects of fire safety management have already been considered in clause 13. And in subparagraph 2, you can see below that, and I think we need to scroll down a little bit to see the entirety of it, there is a 13-point list, A to M, of matters which are to be included in fire safety management. You can see the list there now. And in subparagraph 3, if we could just scroll down to that and have that on the screen, which is at the bottom of the left-hand column and at the top of the right-hand column, it says, points A to K are discussed in the sections of the commentary that follow. Point L is discussed in clause 19 and point M is discussed in clause 20. It is important that matters in the paragraphs that follow are properly considered in the fire risk assessment and that fire safety management is taken into account in the subjective judgment on overall fire risk, clause 18. Guidance on fire safety management of occupied buildings can be found in clause 41 of BS 9999 of 2008. And it goes on to say that PAS 7 was in the process of, or course of development, and in fact, as we know, it came out the following year, 2013. Now, is it right, just looking at everything I've shown you on that page, that a reasonably competent fire risk assessor would be expected to consider all of the fire safety management factors covered in clause 13, 16, 19 and 20 of PAS 79?
Clause 13, 16, 19 and 20.
And the reason I mention those numbers is because they're the numbers of clauses listed here.
As applied to the property the responsible person had in their portfolio, yes.
Yes, indeed. And to take those matters into account in their judgment of overall fire risk, as indeed Roman 3
Yes,
suggests.
I've made that clear, yes.
Yes, and that's clear from Roman 3, I think. And looking at some of those factors listed in subparagraph 2 on page 50, if we can just look at that. If you look at F says, arrangements for routine inspections of the premises and its fire precautions, or for more formal fire audits. Now, in relation to that factor, you've covered that in your report at some length, I think, at Chapter 8. And I'll just give the reference, paragraphs 15 to 19 at page 345. Now, can I just paraphrase? Is it right that you say Mr. Stokes repeatedly raised questions in all of his action plans for Grenfell Tower about whether caretakers or estate service assistants, ESAs, were carrying out their routine inspections and whether records were kept, but stated in the body of his fire risk assessments for Grenfell Tower from 2010 that they were being carried out with records kept? And you, I think, say, is it your opinion that the level of inconsistency doesn't enable the reader to understand the effectiveness of the TMO's arrangements? and that therefore Mr. Stokes' approach doesn't represent an adequate assessment of risk.
That's correct.
Have I summarised your opinion?
Yes, you have.
Thank you.
Yep.
It's a bit of a long summary, I
Yeah.
accept.
No,
Now,
you have.
on that, moving in then, on that basis, would you have expected Mr. Stokes, as part of the conduct of his risk assessment, to have asked for and obtained, where possible, records showing that routine inspections of the premises were being carried out, rather than simply raising it as an action and moving on?
Yes, yes, and particularly when he realised it could have been a repetitive problem.
Yes, and that I think partly answers my next question. Where a fire risk assessor has not managed to obtain records of routine inspections or has simply not been given them and doesn't know whether routine inspections are or aren't being carried out, would you expect that to have been the subject of comment in the fire risk assessment?
Yes, I would have.
And in those circumstances, would you expect a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to factor that in, factor the absence of records about routine inspections into his assessment or calibration?
Yeah, that's correct, as we discussed this morning.
And presumably, is this right, to increase the assessment of the risk or tend to increase the assessment of the risk?
Yeah, exactly. So if arrangements that were being relied upon to control either preventing a fire from starting in the first place or once it has ignited, it's spread, etc., we're back to the exposure of harm increasing, and that causes your risk level to go up.
Yes. Now, the next few questions I've got for you are really on the same sort of line, and so take them quite quickly. If you look on the same page at K, you can see that that is documentation of fire safety arrangements and keeping appropriate records. You see that?
Yeah.
And if we go to page 96 in this document, past 79, this is Annex B, and this is the pro forma template for a fire risk assessment. We can see that there is a section where one has to consider records, 28, appropriate records of, and the fifth item down, maintenance and testing of other fire protection systems. You can see that. Now, in your report in Chapter 8, and I'll just give the reference to people, it's BLARP 250/27, page 90 at paragraph 9.3.15. You observed that Mr. Stokes omitted the section, this section, from the pro forma in past 79 relating to records.
Yes, he did.
And you go on to say that that omission made an important difference.
Yeah.
That's a paragraph 9.3.16. Again, I don't need to take you to that. Can I just ask you to explain why you say it made an important difference?
Yeah, because again, it's about it's about communicating to the responsible person what you've relied upon, but also where, let's say, you're troubled by something you're finding, and giving them a really clear indication. So when it comes to records, a really clear indication that, for example, I mean, this isn't a full list, it's a sample list, that they have X and Y system in the building. You were concerned about the performance or the condition of them, and you made an effort to find the record, and that doesn't seem to exist either. So that's a really important signal to the responsible person of a deficient fire risk management system.
Yes, and would omitting the indication from practice?
To omit record?
Yeah.
No, I don't consider it to be acceptable.
Now, if we go to
recording information is quite clearly explained in the RRA.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, if we go to CST 403145, this is Mr. Stokes's 20th of June 2016 fire risk assessment for Grenfell Tower, his last one. If we go to page 30, that's the first page there, but if we go to page 30, you can see that he has amended the pro forma sections relating to fire safety management to include a question as to whether records were kept. Because you can see the first question, if you go to the top of the page, procedures and arrangements, are there routine in-house fire safety inspections and checks carried out with records kept?
Yes.
And he's ticked that with a yes.
Yes.
And if you go down the page, you'll need to scroll down to section 21 on the screen. Under training, the first question again is with records kept. You see that?
Yeah.
And there's a tick. And then if you go to section 23 on page 32, 2 pages on, There it is. And the second, third and fourth questions there, and indeed the fifth. In fact, all of those on that page, apart from the first, I can see, ask, are records kept?
Yeah.
And some of them is no, and some of them are yes.
Yeah.
Would you agree
Yeah.
that Mr. Stokes had effectively incorporated the separate section on keeping records in the PAS 79 pro forma into his own template adequately?
By splitting it up into the different sections. Yes, I can say that.
And by tacking on with records kept under each heading?
Yes, I could say that, yes.
Yes.
I should have said that.
Well, I'm going to say you sort of said that. So do you maintain your opinion that by removing the specific section, we say made an important difference?
I think I have to withdraw that on the basis of the word record being used elsewhere. But I'm probably more concerned, as you know, with the absence of records. Generally, not the pro forma itself.
Yes, thank you. Now, thank you. Now, let's look at BLARP 25040 at page 48. This is chapter 11. And if I can go to paragraph 18.1.16, you'll see it in the middle of your screen there. You say, secondly, Mr. Stokes states, and this is a reference to his 27th of September 2010 letter, that it is taken that if the item is on the list, i.e. emergency lighting in any town house, then servicing and maintenance is being undertaken and records kept. And then in the next paragraph you say, Mr. Stokes did not intend to verify the undertaking of maintenance or the keeping of records by the KCTMO. Therefore, Mr. Stokes did not intend to make his own assessment of KCTMO's arrangements and instead relied upon KCTMO assertions only.
Yeah.
Now, leaving aside whether that's factually correct, which is a matter for the panel, of course, would you expect a fire risk assessor to check each and every maintenance record for a building? Or would it be enough for him to check a sample of records or otherwise accept the responsible person's assertions or policies that maintenance was being carried out?
I see this is slightly different to this point here, which is a generalised statement about his whole approach is 18.1.16. Okay.
Yes.
He said his intention from the start was to assume it was there and to not check. That's what my comment,
Yes. Well, let's break it up.
Yeah.
Was that alone, was that approach on its own a reasonably acceptable approach?
No.
Given that it wasn't, would you expect a fire risk assessor to check each and every maintenance record for a building, or would it be enough to check a sample or to rely on the assurances given to him by the responsible person or as contained in policies?
Yeah, so just again, that's quite theoretical. So the maintenance policy and procedures to satisfy the maintenance duties under the RRO should be recorded in the fire risk management system and associated documents. So you understand what's planned, when, who's doing it, etc. And then I would expect you to, depending on the quality of the particular system observed during your fire risk assessment, and if you were making comments on maintenance, that you would check some records, not carry out a full assessment of the maintenance regime for the KCTMO, which in itself was very difficult to do because of the absence of records.
Yeah, yes. So when, let me see if I got this right, when Mr. Stokes ticks the box against the question, has something been done with records kept?
And says yes.
And says yes.
Yes.
What investigation of the state of the records would you expect Mr. Stokes to have undertaken?
I expect him to know that records are being kept.
Yes, and when you say know that, satisfy himself by an investigation and inspection of those records, or take it on trust from the responsible?
No, I don't. The risk assessment is meant to be, it's not taken on trust. You're checking things for the responsible person.
And would you check all of the records or a sample? For example, the AOV or the lifts or the dry rising.
You see, I don't know what you mean by all of the records. So there will be specific documents that allow a risk assessor understand the fire performance of the system is being maintained. Maintenance goes well beyond delivering fire performance.
Yes,
Okay. So if you're asking me if I think you want me to give some kind of percentage, I don't have a percentage, but I think if you're going to take records kept for any life safety system, you will have made it your business to go and look at some records.
Right. And I take it, well, by some you mean enough to give the fire risk assessor reasonable confidence that the measure has been adequately maintained.
The measure is being adequately maintained to perform in a fire.
Exactly.
Okay?
Thank you, that's helpful. Now, can we then go back to past 79, page 50, please, which is CTA 703. Yes. Can we go to 16L, 16 Roman 2L, which says implementation of the action plan's recommendations. It's one of the matters to be taken into account when analysing fire safety management. Now, on that, if Mr. Stokes was aware that the TMO had problems completing his action plan recommendations on time, and there was a persistent and generic issue with tackling a backlog of action, would you have expected him to refer in his fire risk assessments to that wider problem?
Yes.
And would you have expected him to have undertaken each subsequent fire risk assessment with that fact in mind?
Yes.
And factored it into his calibration of the risk for each building?
Yes.
And in view of the backlog issue, would you have expected Mr. Stokes to have offered at least general advice to those responsible at the TMO on the fire risk consequences that they were bearing as a result of not completing those actions he had recommended on time?
Yes.
And the need to ensure appropriate resources were allocated for doing so?
For the risk assessor to say, to describe resources?
Yes.
Or to warn the responsible person resources were a problem. I see resources as a responsible person's issue.
I follow.
Yeah.
I see. Can I then turn to a different topic, but one related to the last answer, or last set of answers, and that's risk rating matrix. Now, if we can go to BLARP 25027, this is chapter 8 of your report. I'd like to look at pages 489 and 490. And on those pages we see table 20.2, and there it is, where you've provided your own assessment of the risk using the PAS 79 method and classifications.
Yes, I've provided, I said I was working within the approach taken by Mr. Stokes.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. You're putting your, as I understand it, you're doing what you should have done.
No, it's not my personal fire risk assessment for Grenfell Tower.
No.
But I took his approach and the risk, the factors that contributed to his risk level, and I thought about the accuracy of what he had recorded in his risk assessment, and I tried to show where they increase or decrease one of the parameters.
Yes, I understand.
Okay,
yes.
So it might sound technically not relevant, but it's different to an independent new fire risk assessment.
I understand that, because you might have taken things into account that he didn't.
Yeah, exactly. So I was just trying to show, based on what he recorded in his risk assessment, where it impacts one of the parameters that contributes to risk. Okay?
Yes.
I don't think it's just a technical point.
Now, on that, if we go to page 490, you deal with the external wall construction there.
Yeah, yeah.
And you conclude that the risk was intolerable.
Yes, yes.
You see that?
Yeah, no, I can see that. So I probably should just explain, will I? Or
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So in 2016, using Mr. Stokes' risk assessment, construction was still underway, and he still didn't know about control measures during construction, if they were needed or not. He called that medium, so I would put that up to high because he didn't know anything about the control measures. And then I've set out the other issues that arose with respect to the harm levels and what that causes the risk level to be in 2016. Okay.
Yes. And you say there, in the fourth line, stay put policy needs to be changed to total evacuation, not possible.
Yeah.
Is that because of your view of the risk posed by the external, posed by the risk of external fire spread as a result of the cladding?
Yeah, so the hazard posed by the external wall, and obviously we've discussed at length, and its effect on the compartmentation.
Yeah. If you were to undertake the same exercise
Yeah.
in table 20.2,
Yeah.
again, but this time excluding the risk posed by the cladding,
Oh. Yeah.
would your classification of the resulting risk differ, do you think?
Yes, and also I think it's important to be clear that I would have made it my business to find out the control measures in place while the contractor was still in place, and I would want to have dropped high down to medium based on information about the controls.
I see.
If that makes sense.
So if you ignored,
Okay.
if you took out, for whatever reason, the external wall construction, is it right that you would be left with either moderate or substantial?
Yeah, exactly.
But one way or the other, you wouldn't be left with tolerable.
No, one way or the other, you wouldn't be left with tolerable.
Okay.
But the idea of these things is, even if one of the parameters is, let's say at a higher level, you do some work to try and bring it down to through controls, so then you can bring your risk level down. You don't let it hanging at substantial. I would want to say, if you knew about control measures with the contractor, and if you knew this and you knew that, I can bring those parameters down.
Yes.
It's a work in progress.
Yes, I see. And that, I think, leads to the next question based
Yeah.
on PAS 79. If we can just go back to that, please.
Yeah.
Which is CTA 703, page 98. I just want to look at page 98 again, which is the FRA template.
Yeah.
That includes there a section for a fire risk assessor to set out the anticipated assessment of the resultant risk once the actions identified in the plan are taken into account.
Yeah.
And you can see that the different risk levels are set out.
Yeah, and there's the 5 levels, and then the text beside it are to do with actions and timescale.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Stokes, it's right, I think, isn't it, that Mr. Stokes didn't include this approach, if you like, or certainly not part of this template in any of his FRAs or his action plans.
Do you mean this text here, or the action and timescale text?
This text here.
No, he didn't. Can we not just open up his table? He didn't. But he didn't. But he used the risk estimator.
Yes.
The 5 category, he did.
But what he didn't do, I think, was to set out the anticipated assessment of the resultant risk once the actions identified had been taken into account, or dealt with, I should say.
Yeah, no, that's correct, yes.
No.
Yeah.
And let's pin this back to your report, perhaps.
Yeah.
If we go to BLARP, 25027, pages 205 to 206, and look at paragraphs 9.8.12.
Oh, yeah,
page.
yeah.
You set out at 11 that part of the action plan,
Yeah.
and then you say at 12 at the foot of the screen, there is therefore an important difference between how Mr. Stokes sets out his record of significant findings and action plans and how PAS 79 defines them, which is with a clear acknowledgement of how it reduces the risk and to what risk level.
Yeah, exactly.
Key difference revolves around the purpose of the actions required being to reduce the risk to tolerable or trivial.
Yeah.
And then you go on to say, I'll just read the rest to you. Although Mr. Stokes is carrying out step 9 of his 11-step methodology and formulating an action plan with the aim being to reduce the fire risk from the significant findings with both physical and procedural controls, Mr. Stokes has not explained the purpose of the actions, nor how they were deemed by him to impact the risk classification. Because Mr. Stokes only ever classified Grenfell Tower as tolerable, without making that assessment dependent upon the completion of the action plan, technically this meant that he deemed no actions were necessary, or else maybe he meant those actions were needed to maintain the risk level at tolerable. In the event those actions were not dealt with, which as I go on to show was a regular occurrence over the years in Grenfell Tower, then that risk level was not an accurate one. In fact, Mr. Stokes regularly classified his actions as high priority, close out in 2 to 3 weeks. And then you conclude at 18, this: his failure to connect the actions required to a potential consequence for the relevant persons in his technical method, and more importantly, his failure to communicate the connection to consequences in its documentation, was a significant one. Now, my question is, why was it a significant one?
Because of the 2 points I've just made there, that the consequence to the relevant person, so the harm level. Because are we able to go back to the risk estimator table? I'll just use that, where it has probability on the left and consequence on the top and the risk levels in the matrix. Are we able to put that up?
Yes, that
okay, just
in your table.
No, in past 79.
In past 79,
yeah,
yes,
or
certainly.
it'll be here in the
Certainly,
next
it's
page.
a CTA 703, page 98.
And go, oh, look, it's not that one. It's okay. Don't worry about it. It's okay. So let's go back to the text you asked me about.
Is this the? It might help to show you page 97 then. Perhaps that's the better approach.
Yeah, perfect.
Right, got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
lovely. So you can have the same risk level from a different probability of occurrence and a consequence of failure. Okay, so depending on the type of harm, the grading of harm, and depending on the likelihood, you can end up at the same risk level, but the harm levels are different. Okay.
Yes.
Does that make sense? So there's another matrix that shows that a bit better. So when you don't explain the harm level caused by particular hazards and why the actions are needed to deal with either the harm or the probability, it's very difficult to establish the meaning, the true meaning of the risk level and its effect on the relevant persons, okay? And we've talked at length about the idea of an action. It's either to deal with the probability, so, dropping back down to low, or you're trying to bring the harm potential down. So it's very express. And obviously, a parameter that impacts harm can be more important, for example, than an action that may be dealing with probability, depending on the circumstance.
And just to try to explain that to people perhaps less familiar with, with risk analysis than you, you're, I think, saying that you can have a high risk or high chance of the likelihood of fire resulting in slight harm.
Exactly.
But you can also have an unusually low likelihood of fire, but when it breaks out, would result in extreme harm.
Exactly. Okay. So that's why the actions, their timescale, their priority, and being clear on why they're relevant to the final risk level and the parameters driving that risk level are so important for the responsible person to know.
Now, can we go back to past 79 again and look, please, at CTA 503, page 60. This is clause 19.2, which is where we go next. And it says, under 19.2, the action plan should be such as to ensure that, if implemented, it will reduce fire risk to or maintain fire risk at a tolerable level.
Yeah.
And in your report, you say, and I don't think I need to take you to it, for reference purposes, it's BLARP 250/27, page 59, at paragraph 5.5.10. You say the input of actions to the previous action plan and to the new action plan is critical, as in either case it is a record as to whether the implementation of the action plan would reduce fire risk to or maintain it at the following level, trivial or tolerable.
Yeah.
Could you just explain why the exercise is critical, as you say?
Well, I think it's as I've just described it.
So it's your previous answer?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Right. Now, Mr. Stokes told the inquiry that his description of the fire risk at Grenfell as tolerable related to the status of the premises before or after the actions were carried out. And he says that, in essence, that the premises risk rating for Grenfell Tower would have been tolerable both before and after the identified actions were carried out, had they been carried out. What do you make of that?
I don't really understand what that means.
Let me show you.
But maybe, I mean, then if it was tolerable whether or not the actions occurred, then probably the actions weren't required in the first place. But I might be taking it a bit too far.
Well, lest I'm at risk of misquoting Mr. Stokes, let me just show you what he said. It's day 137, page 50, at line 16. The question at line 16 picks up in the second sentence. PAS 79 suggests that the tolerable box is ticked so as to maintain or reduce the level to what is ticked. So is the answer that it is only once, as I think you say, the actions are completed, that the risk is tolerable? Answer: in the particular case here, before they were tolerable, the actions would still make the building tolerable when it's completed as well. Now that is what he said. Perhaps we ought to go on to the next question and answer. Well, does that tell us that even though there are a number of red and amber items, it doesn't matter, go on over the page, to the risk level or to the risk to life level, whether or not they're completed? Answer: in this particular case, the risk level is broad enough to include tolerable within those.
Right.
Now, with that extract in mind, would you expect a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to calculate the risk to a building at the same level, both at the time of the assessment as it stood and putatively after the actions identified within the action plan had been carried out?
I think that, no.
No. Given Mr. Stokes' assessment of the risk for Grenfell Tower as always tolerable,
yes,
should the number of high priority actions have been an indication to the reasonable or reasonably competent fire risk assessor that the risk presented was in fact greater than tolerable, not least because the number of actions tended to suggest a lack of adequate controls applied to one or more significant fire hazards?
Yes, that's correct.
And thus a high risk likelihood of fire?
Potentially, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Depending on the severity of the priority item we're discussing. But it changes the risk level.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Lane, I've come to the end, you'll be glad to hear, of my questions for you.
Oh, right. Okay.
It's customary at this point for us to take a break.
Yeah.
And see if there are any questions which others outside this room, or perhaps inside this room, have for us. I'm going to ask the chairman perhaps for us to take a short break, because I'm quite keen not to keep you here over the lunch break, if possible.
Well, I thought quarter of an hour would be long enough, wouldn't it?
I would think it is probably long enough. If we were to say...
Well, what I think I shall say is that we'll come back at 1:45.
Yes.
Okay.
Unless you send a message to the effect that more time is required.
That's very sensible. Thank you.
Is that
Yes,
all right?
good idea.
Yeah, no.
So
that's
we'll
not,
take
I
the
wasn't
usual
expecting
break at
that
this
all.
point.
Yeah, okay.
And we'll come back at 1:45.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, as I say, we'll come back at 1:45 unless you tell us otherwise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes.
Thank you. Good. Would you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? Right, Dr. Lane, well, shall we see if Mr. Millett's got any more questions for you? Yes, Mr. Millett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Lane, you will be delighted to hear that I have no further questions for you.
Okay.
And it therefore remains for me to thank you very much for coming here to the inquiry and assisting us with your expert opinions. We're extremely grateful to you. And obviously there are further matters to be explored with you later in this inquiry at Module 7 in relation to the Aov system.
Yes.
But subject to that, we're very grateful for your views on the matters arising in Module 3.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Dr. Lane is right that I should thank you on behalf of all the members of the panel. We found your evidence very interesting, very illuminating, and we're very grateful to you for the amount of work that's gone in to the very substantial reports that you've prepared.
Yes.
So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah.
And we'll look forward to seeing you again in due course.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, you're free to go now. Thank you. Right, Mr. Millett. Well, is that it for today?
Mr. Chairman, it is it for the day, and I should also say that subject to Dr. Lane's views on AOV and further evidence potentially about that, that is all the evidence for the inquiry for Module 3.
Good. Well, thank you very much. So we will stop at that point for today, and we'll resume on Monday at 10 o'clock.
Monday, 10 o'clock.
When we shall, I think, hear some closing statements,
yes,
not?
For Modules 1 and 2.
Modules 1 and 2.
Correct.
Good. Thank you very much. Well, then 10 o'clock next Monday. Thank you very much.